Where is Mojtaba Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader? The 56-year-old became leader at the start of the Iran war after his father, Ali Khamenei, was killed by US-Israeli strikes. Other members of his family were also killed, including his wife and son. But Mojtaba has not been seen since becoming supreme leader. In fact, no one has even heard his voice. So what do we know about him? Well, it appears to the outside world that he was seriously injured in that US-Israeli attack that killed his father, wife and son, as well as others. But there is huge speculation as to the extent of those injuries. This week, the New York Times produced a long article claiming he's had his leg operated on several times, surgery on his hand, and that his face and lips were severely burnt, which means he has difficulty speaking. So is that really the case? Could Iran's supreme leader really be so incapacitated? Well, let's speak to Siyavush Ranjbar Daime, who is senior lecturer in modern Middle Eastern history at the University of St Andrews in Scotland. Great to speak to you. What do we know about the condition of the supreme leader?
Well, there has been a lot of speculation since his selection as supreme leader a couple of months ago, driven by the fact that there still hasn't been a confirmed photo, video, or audio statement released after his elevation to supreme leader. And we had very little before that anyways. So all we had in the past couple of months were written statements, either read out on state radio television by others, or just released in text format in his social media channels. There has been a lot of speculation. The New York Times recently had an extended article. The available information, I would say, points towards Mojtaba Khamenei being alive rather than being dead, being subject to some form of injury. The state media said it straight away after his elevation that he's a jambaz, or a term usually reserved for people who have serious injuries as a consequence of war. No further detail has been released, but it does also seem that he is involved in one way or another in the decision-making, and therefore he has his mental abilities with him.
So just picking up on that New York Times article, and there were some very specific claims there about injuries to him, particularly to his face, to his mouth, to his hand, and other details as well. What do you make of those very specific claims in that article?
Well, they can't be corroborated. That article isn't sourced openly. Only one source is named. That source has proven not to be very reliable in the past, or is not somebody really intimately connected to the inner workings of the Iranian state, has long been on the sidelines. So we can't really tell. I would say that's speculation, and there are opportunities, there are instances in which previous speculation was made by the same reporter and the New York Times, for example, on the health of Khamenei Sr., only for Khamenei Sr. to appear in public the following day in good health. So there is doubts over whether that is precise. But again, available information based also on what little has trickled out of official channels and official media points out to Mojtaba, a combination between Mojtaba Khamenei being injured in that initial strike which killed his father and other relatives, and also security precautions being very tightened up as a consequence of the intelligence failings which led to the assassination of so many high-level officials.
Yes.
And I think it's a combination of these two things which has resulted in Mojtaba Khamenei not being seen in public so far.
And I was going to pick up on that because, of course, many people are claiming that he is in hiding and that no senior people visit him so that he can't be tracked. Do you think that possibly is the case then, if you're citing, obviously, the assassination of his father?
That is the case, but we have to bear in mind that his father had a different approach during the June 2025 war, which, of course, he survived. Back then, he did give a few video addresses from his safe place during the conflict. A short time after the ceasefire, he did re-emerge in his now destroyed compound to lead a religious ceremony. So his father braved the situation, if you want, and did appear in public because that was part of his modus operandi. It was his constant constant physical appearances in front of large crowds of supporters, and keeping up that sort of modus operandi. This kind of situation cannot mid to long term. At some point, the supporters of the regime will need to see some physical evidence, will need to see an approach which is different from that of just issuing written declarations which are read out or are published by third parties.
Well, the question of who is running Iran is causing a lot of speculation. In a recent Truth Social post, the US President Donald Trump said Iran is having a very hard time figuring out who their leader is. They just don't know. The infighting is between the hardliners who've been losing badly on the battlefield and the moderates who are not moderate at all, but gaining respect is crazy. And then he talks about how the US has control of the Strait of Hormuz. But Iran's president hit back on the social media platform X, writing, "In Iran, there are no hardliners or moderates. We're all Iranians and revolutionaries, with ironclad unity of nation and state and obedience to the supreme leader. We will make the aggressor regret." He goes on to say, one God, one nation, one leader, one path, victory for Iran, dearer than life. So the question remains, who is in control of Iran at this moment in time?
We saw that tasks have been divided. The Iranian president and the government are dealing with everyday concerns, tasks, keeping the economy going, keeping the basic services distributed, and staving off immediate economic hardship by the population at large. The mantle of diplomacy and dealing with negotiations is taken up by this figure, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, the Majlis Speaker. But he's there because, of course, he has for the time being survived. And if Ali Larijani, the National Security Council, the head of the Supreme National Security Council, would have stayed alive, would not have been assassinated, he would have been the one dealing with the negotiations. So what we see now in terms of leadership really is really who survived and who is in a position of influence, and who has the right combination between military and civilian experience and track record to run the negotiations. This is not the same as saying that these people have the same ability as these other people. Again, somebody like Ghalibaf is prominent at the moment because of the rate and the scope and the level of assassinations which occurred both in June 2025 and in the 40-day war that we just witnessed.
But what about the Revolutionary Guard then? Do you think that they really are in control? Because there has been a lot of talk about how they have had childhood links even with the supreme leader. So do you think that they are still, that they are actually pulling the strings behind the scenes?
Well, by and large, the senior leadership of the Revolutionary Guard at the moment is composed of effectively a group of appointees of Khamenei Senior. Khamenei Senior had a very keen interest in military affairs since his persistent presence as president on the Iran-Iraq war front. And in the 37 years in which he was supreme leader, he really built and shaped the IRGC as a very solidly loyal elite military force. So it is clear that the current leaders, who are, again, much like many of the surviving political leadership, owe their positions really to their loyalty and proximity, and the appointments of Khamenei Senior will be close to his family. And one of the logics, I think one of the key elements in the logic behind choosing Mojtaba Khamenei as supreme leader was to maintain the form and function and relationships that the Supreme Leader's office had with the rest of the Islamic Republic system, primarily the IRGC. So it is reasonable to expect that the bonds between them will be tight. However, the relationship will be very different because, of course, the experience and the bonds that were forged in the 1980s between Khamenei Senior and the IRGC and the current IRGC leadership, particularly if you look at it from an age perspective, will be different from the ones that his son will have forged. And again, his father, we shouldn't forget that he was a very tactile sort of leader, if you want, very able to hold these meetings and to hold these gatherings and more. And he had his own sense of loyalty, despite the fact that this did not prevent, for example, the intelligence failings and leaks that led to the possibility of targeting all these individual leaders during the 40-day war. So the extent to which these links can simply be transferred over to Mojtaba Khamenei needs to be seen, particularly if this current peculiar situation concerning his whereabouts and activities remains.
Yes, because I was going to ask you, to pick up on the fact that despite all this concern, confusion about the Iranian leadership and who really is in control, Iran can still wage a war. I know we're talking about a ceasefire at the moment, but still they're able to do that. Is that sustainable?
Well, we shouldn't forget that Iran is not some insurgent group like Hamas or Hezbollah. It is a full-blown state system that has had access to billions of dollars in oil revenue and despite the intelligence failing, was always preparing for this, because throughout the 37 years of his leadership, Khamenei Sr. Kept really instilling this idea that ultimately the West is an enemy, ultimately the US and Israel are enemies that have to be faced on the military side. Again, Khamenei Sr. had a very keen interest in military affairs going back to the 1980s. So there is a plan in place, and clearly they're implementing a plan. Whether this plan is really sustainable in the long term, or whether it's a plan that is good for wars that are measured in days rather than months. For example, the 12-day war we had in June 2025, or the 38 or 40-day war we had now. Really, this has not been proven, particularly as Iran, of course, had a very serious economic crisis at the eve of this conflict, which resulted in the January 2026 protests. We shouldn't forget, those were a few months ago. And several thousand people being killed in a weekend of heavy repression. So that sort of factors at some point will come to weigh in once the fog of war clears up, as it did in January 2026. That was obviously 6 months after the end of the conflict. In order to prevent that sort of situation from happening, clearly there has to be an outcome to this to this February 2026 conflict, which is different from June. So a ceasefire, or a sort of a very fragile ceasefire, which is, of course, compounded with the situation around the Strait of Hormuz, which will eventually start to bring will have an economic cost for Iran as well, beyond, of course, having an economic cost for the global economy as it has, will simply not be conducive to the consolidation, I would say, and the stability of the current ruling group, I would say.
Well, that was Siavush Ranjbar-Daime from the University of St Andrews, who was trying to help us work out who is running Iran and where the supreme leader really is. Well, thanks to you all for watching, and do remember you can keep up with the latest on our website, dw.com, or on social media, where our handle is always @DW News. Thanks again for your company, and see you next time.